So I'll be talking about post-fire oak survival and regeneration, and mentioning a case study in which I'm following recovery of oak woodlands that were affected by the river fire that was part of the Mendocino Complex fire in 2018. I think it's really important to kind of make this clear is that we live in a fire-adapted ecosystem. We, for the most part, most of California's natural landscapes are in Mediterranean climate zone, meaning we have hot, dry summers with lots of natural fire start events through dry lightning storms. And so fire is a common disturbance, made even more common by Native American management for thousands of years. And so that has shaped how our flora and fauna have adapted, and in particular, the oaks. So it's important to remember that. I know sometimes our first inclinations after these events is kind of to see what happens on the landscape and to be kind of, really concerned about what's happened to the trees and to the vegetation. But for the most part, you leave it alone and it'll regenerate on its own. So well, I'll be talking about oaks, and I want to talk about kind of two really awesome life history strategies that oaks have that really help them recover from these types of disturbances from fire. So the first one is, fire tolerance. And really what that means is that think about these oak species with really thick bark. So let's say blue oak, black oak, coast live oak as an example. And really what that means is essentially the tree can tolerate physical damage, the tree actually burning, catching on fire and burning. So you see in this photo on the top left, we have large blue oaks, and there's some evidence of fire damage on the stem. When you hack the bark off, you see that the outer inch or so of the bark has been killed by the fire, by the actual heat of the fire. But below that, where the black line is, that's healthy bark, and more critically, the healthy woody tissue beneath that. So the trees have evolved an ability to actually tolerate physical damage from fire. The other life strategy that's pretty cool, and remember, these are kind of broad groupings and characterizations of oak fire adaptive strategies. The other one is called fire embracing, which I think is a really neat way of thinking about it. And so think of these as your oaks with thin bark. So your interior live oak, scrub oaks, the species that have relatively thin bark when you think about the difference between coast live oak and interior live oak. And essentially what the strategy here for these species is on the top left. On the right side, you see that the fire damage was clear through the wood. And essentially the tree, if I'm going to anthropomorphize the tree, basically the tree is saying, hey, look, instead of investing a lot of resources in trying to survive a fire event or tolerate a fire event, I'm just kind of essentially going to let the fire kill my above ground biomass, and then quickly on the photo on the right, you see regenerate new tissue. And so it's really important distinction to think about the above ground biomass portion of an oak tree and the below ground biomass portion. And so fire events can, and I'll explore this more in a little bit, but fire events can kill the above ground biomass, but not necessarily result in a dead tree. And so we see quick regeneration of these species following fire. And quick, I mean within a month, if not less. And so basically you can kind of experience stands with these types of species or high severity fire events. You have this mortality that appears the trees are dead, but they regenerate through a resprout. And it's, even though we have kind of these general groupings of fire embracing, fire tolerance, all oak species resprout, showing that they can tolerate different types of fire severity or fire intensity. And so it's really important to remember that, because when we think of wildland fire, the fire impact is highly variable across the landscape. So on the left side, we have a landscape that had what we would call low severity fire, and fire severity is essentially the measure or the quantification of the physical damage or the ecological impact of the fire. Different from fire intensity, which is the actual kind of quantification of the chemistry or the physics of the fire itself. And so here we're looking at the ecological impact of damage that the fire did to the trees. On the left side, you see that we would call that low severity, lots of charring on the bark, right? A little bit of bark consumption, but for the most part, the trees survive and they're all alive. And these are your fire tolerant species. And even some of your fire embracing species can do really well in low severity fires. In the middle, we have moderate severity fires. This is where you have the transition where your fire tolerant species are probably more likely to survive. There's a higher amount of charring and consumption of the bark tissues. Now you get some higher flame into the canopy, so maybe you're scorching some of the foliar tissue. As we're on the very right, we have a high severity fire stand, and this is essentially an event where even if your strategy is, or the oak tree strategy is tolerant, the fire severity is high enough that maybe you're having a standard placement event and all of your oak species are resprouting under these conditions. So how do we assess fire damage? How do we kind of look at a stand in terms of the fire severity or what happened in the stand? Really, the most important indication is the survival of the cambium. So the cambium is this really critically important layer of tissue that occurs right under the bark and sits on top of the woody tissue. And this is where the most active living portion of the stem. This is where all cell division occurs, nutrients transportation occurs. And so this is the critical layer of tissue that will determine whether the above ground biomass of the tree will survive. And so in these photos on the bottom right, what we have on the left is, again, we see that the outer portion of the bark is killed, but the cambium, which is this white tissue at the center, has a healthy creamy color. It means it's still alive. And so there's a very good chance that even if only 10% of the circumference of that stem is still alive and has this kind of tissue, there's a very high chance that that tree will survive, even if it has diminished kind of aesthetic qualities or it kind of struggles, but it will survive. Whereas this on the right, this is dead cambium, right? We saw this photo earlier, but this is where the tissue was killed by the heat. Either the heat was sitting on the bark and it kind of heated up and killed the cambium, or they actually burned the cambium tissue itself. And so you see this kind of damage on your tree, and you see the majority of a tree expressing this kind of damage. It's less likely to survive. The above ground biomass is less likely to survive. And you know, the best way to determine the survival of the cambium is to hack the bark off, but sometimes you can get a good indication of the impact of the fire to the tree just by observing the condition of the bark. So here again, kind of grouped into these fire severities, low to high. On the left, we have a low severity fire event where you can see that there is charring on the bark, but the structure and kind of the pattern of the bark is still obvious, which means that likely that cambial tissue is still alive and the tree is probably relatively had a relatively good chance of survival. The middle to moderate severity, you have more bark consumption, so there's more fire on the bark, more of the bark was consumed. You see cracking in the bark, that really indicates that there's probably some cambium damage, but not necessarily a lot, or that it's persistent. On the right, we have high severity fire. Here, it's pretty obvious. You see that the wood is exposed on kind of the sunnier side of that tree and was actually burned. So this is a really good indication. Lots of cracking, lots of bark consumption. The wood is exposed. It's a very good indication of that tree. The above ground biomass of that tree will probably die. All right, so that's kind of how we kind of, well, I say we, but I myself and as we're assessing woodlands, it's kind of the first signs we look at to determine the condition of the stand and how the fire impacted the trees. I don't have photos, but I will say that looking at the canopy and the scorch, we call it, is not a good indication of survival. Foliar tissue is expendable, right? We have deciduous oaks, and even with evergreen oaks, they regenerate the foliage. And so the oak trees can tolerate damage to the canopy, to the foliage, and actually have shock or browning of the foliage from heat or flame damage, or they can even be burned. But as long as the woody tissue on the stems and the branches and the twigs is still alive, that foliage will regenerate. So looking at, you know, it's not attractive, but you see your browned out oak tree on the landscape, that doesn't mean the tree's dead. That just means following a fire event, that just means the canopy was affected. And it's very, very likely that if the fire occurs early enough this season, it might even start regenerating new leaves that season, or the next spring, you'll see a whole new flush of foliage from unaffected areas. So I want to talk about a case study just to show you how this kind of plays out in time, how the oak woodlands recover through time following these fire events. So the study I'm talking about, as I mentioned, was the 2008 river fire, part of the Mendocino complex. It was ultimately, I think, around 70,000 acres. But in the first 32 hours, it burned. It started on July 27th, and by the end of July 28th, it was around 10,000 acres. And so it burned through the Hopland Research and Extension Center, which is a research campus, part of the UC system, and it burned about 3,400 acres of the center. And just to kind of give you a sense of the fire behavior, it was wind-driven and a pretty, for the most part, fast-moving fire. I did the calculations at 10,000 acres within 32 hours. We're looking at about 300 acres per hour that it was a rate of expansion. So that's frankly, that's a pretty intense fire. Based on the growth of the LNU fire, that's pretty similar to the kind of conditions that we were experiencing with these fires. All right, so I would like to think that maybe these fires have had relatively similar impacts on the landscape. So the fire was burning through rangeland, oak woodland, chaparral, very similar conditions to what we're experiencing right now. And though there's a lot of variability in the fire history and the landscape and the LNU fire, at this particular research site, there is no record of fire. So within the last 100 years or so, there had been no fire, landscape level fire that occurred in this area, which I would suspect that a lot of areas in the LNU also have the same kind of fire history. So I collected data immediately after the fire within a couple months, and my first impressions would be that about 41% of the oak trees that I surveyed were dead. They appeared dead. There's no green tissue. They were completely burned over like in this photo. They all had moderate to high burn severity damage. So remember, that means that there's extensive consumption of the bark. And when we look at the cambium, a lot of it has been damaged and killed. And the char height or the length was kind of an indication of either flame length or the flames actually traveling up, burning up the stem, was typically 60%, 7% of the tree height. So we're looking at pretty high flame lengths. And, you know, as I said, it's not very reliable characteristic, but for the most part, these trees had pretty much completely scorched and canopies were kind of burned off. In comparison, living trees, as kind of would be expected, had low severity charring, so very low percent or very low heights of flames carrying up into the on the stem. As you can see in the photo on the right, you know, that right side of that tree is burned, but really most of the damage is on the moss that was on that tree. But there's still evidence of charring. The trees were still alive. They still had foliage that was green. And you see maybe in the larger landscape kind of panorama at the bottom, you see that some of the foliage was charred, but for the most part, the trees were alive. There's even still green moss on rocks in the understory. But what's really interesting, remember, this is only a few months after the fire, that 29% of the trees we classified as living had complete or near total above ground biomass mortality. Remember, I said that the above ground biomass can burn off, but the root structure can be still alive. And already within this short amount of time, we see this really incredible response of epicormic and basal sprouting. So epicormic sprouting is the kind of development and expansion of foliage occurring on the stem and in the branches. So not, you know, foliage being produced in areas where you wouldn't expect it, right? So you're thinking maybe I would have leaves on the twigs and the buds, but when the trees are stressed, this is not just an oak thing, a lot of trees do this, hardwoods, they will produce photosynthetic tissue or leaves from the main stem or larger branches, kind of like a stress response. That if they've lost all of their leaves and they need to continue to produce sugars and accumulate nutrients, then they will do this kind of emergency development of photosynthetic tissue. And so it's a really kind of good indication of how stressed a tree is. So, but it's also a sign the tree is not completely dead yet. And then we have our basal sprouts, which are more kind of common sense in that, you know, all of a sudden your tree looks dead, but there's green sprouts coming out from the base, which is a really awesome response to see in these stands. So pretty much rapid fire, 30%, just under 30% of the trees that we're seeing were already starting to regenerate. So in 2019, we went back and we assessed our area, and this was, I was pretty impressed by this. Remember, it was 42 or so percent in 2018. Mortality, truly dead trees that had no regeneration of any type had dropped down to about 13%, which I thought was pretty spectacular. And of the living trees, 81% of those had what we would consider complete above ground biomass mortality, and we're aggressively producing basal sprouts. So remember, oaks will kind of, as you can see in these photos, will produce multiple stems, and I was pretty impressed with the rate of growth. So immediately after the fire, the handful of trees that we did see that had sprouts, they were maybe 6 inches, if that high, maybe a couple inches. A year following, they're already 2 feet high. I haven't come back in 2020 this year to reassess those plots, but I have been out to the site. And I would say for the most part, on average, basal sprouts have reached about 6 feet high. So the regenerative ability of these trees, even in areas that had pretty significant impact, is pretty impressive. As expected, 100% ground cover regeneration. The herbaceous and shrubby species do exceptionally well. And what's really great to see is that we're seeing natural regeneration. So not just sprouting, but we're seeing recruitment of oak seedlings. So this is really great to see some of the benefits of having fire in some of these systems. Insects and diseases are not a serious issue in oak woodlands, as is unlike in conifer stands, where you have to be extremely concerned about bark beetles coming in and impacting your trees. For the most part, we only found evidence of insects and disease or insects on dead trees or the dead portions of trees. And we found some powdery mildew on California black oak sprouts, which is pretty common. I think the biggest issue was deer browse. So the deer aggressively hit the sprouts, particularly when the herbaceous species start to dry out and the sprouts are still green. They go after them really intensely. Fortunately, the trees just increase the rate of resprout, and so they just create, in this photo you see a really shrubby response, and so they kind of can compensate for a while on that browse. All right, so quickly considering management goals, as always, I like to say it depends on your goals and objectives. So what are you planning to do with your oak woodlands? So think about how you or the landowners you work with, what they want to do, and that's what should dictate what your next steps are. As always, it's important to consult a registered professional of forestry if you're doing anything forestry related. And if you want to assess your trees for risk or for health, you can contact consulting arborists. As Rich said, I concur. Initially, I would do nothing. In the oak woodlands, I think that's your best bet. They're highly fire adapted. They will respond and recover on their own. I think as little intervention as possible would be the best, at least initially. You do want to consider removing trees that could become hazardous. So those trees that could fall on structures or injure people, or that could block routes of access within your defensible space. And these typically can be large trees that have at least 50% of their stem with severe damage, or these smaller trees that typically are not as fire tolerant and have higher rates of damage. But when possible, leave trees that are dead above ground biomass, leave them standing. They provide really important protection for oak regeneration. They provide wildlife habitat. When they break down, they return nutrients into the system. They create complex structures and have lots of important ecological functions as the stands regenerate. If you are going to consider intervention or management, reassess after several growing seasons. So you want to let them recover for at least a year or more. And this is when you can come in and think about removing. If you have high value trees, even falling, maybe this is now that you have a pretty good sense of how they're going to respond. Maybe this is when you start thinking about removing some of those trees or doing fuels reduction work when you're concerned about managing for fire safety. If you have areas where there was a lot of high severity fire damage and there's no natural regeneration occurring, no basal sprouting or seedling recruitment, you can think about planting acorns. You have to be they're finicky, so you have to be a little bit conscientious of how you do this, and then you're gonna have to protect them from herbivory because they will get eaten if they're not protected, particularly if you have lots of wildlife issues. And then this is the time you can also think about pruning basal sprouts. So as I said, the trees will produce tons and tons of sprouts, and after a few years, for example, in my study, they're about 6 feet high. You can go in there and find the most vigorous resprouts and trim the rest out, and that way the tree will focus its resources in producing those stems, and you can replace the tree, the above ground biomass portion of the tree, quicker with the tree of your choice. All right, so that's all I have. Resources I recommend you check out for a deep dive into all things oaks. The website UC Oaks, if you just type that in your search bar, it should be the first thing that pops up. And it's a phenomenal website that we manage and has lots of resources. They have under the resources tab on the page just for talking about fire. And so there's lots of guidelines and recommendations for managing oak woodlands post-fire. And then as always, I mentioned you need to contact a registered professional forester if you are looking to manage these stands. Any type of forestry related issues, you need to work with a registered professional forester. All right, well, thank you. And I don't know if I have time for questions, but maybe later on we can do Q&A.
I'm going to throw one quick one at you, Mike. I'm actually going to combine a couple of questions that came in. One question was, is there anything that you can do to help the oaks regenerate? And kind of a related question, how much of the survival or regeneration really relies on the amount of rainfall that we get?
Yeah. Oh, good question. So no, I would say there's no, there's nothing you can do to help. The best thing you can do is to leave it alone. Let it regenerate naturally. Let it regenerate on its own, and you'll be pretty impressed with the response. And I think rain is important, but think about these trees have been exposed to some pretty extreme drought conditions over the last few years, and then they're getting hit by fire and they're still regenerating. So rain, like the seasonality of rain, is not as important as long-term precipitation patterns. And so if the kind of inclination is to irrigate in these systems, definitely don't do that. Adding water to naturally grown adapted oaks can actually be pretty detrimental. So let them regenerate on their own, and they will respond the way they do. And if you have to reassess because there's a drought condition or something like that, then we can revisit that. I stopped sharing a screen, but I think my contact info is posted in the content for the workshop. And feel free to reach out if you or your landowners, if you're working with landowners, have questions. I'll be more than happy to talk with you further about this, and even conduct site visits to kind of go out and assess the initial kind of conditions and management recommendations.